Welcome to Reinvent and the Reinvent series, Reinventing American Foreign Policy, where today we're going to be looking at how do we resolve a lot of these ratcheting tensions between individual privacy and national security. I'm Peter Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent. I'm going to be helping moderate the conversation today. Now, there's been a ton of interest in the last few weeks about the current manifestation of the tug-of-war, you could say, between individual privacy and national security. And that is taking the form of Apple's refusal to cooperate with the FBI and build software that essentially would unlock the iPhone of the San Bernardino terrorists. Now, we're not going to pile into the scrum around that specific conversation too much and go into all the details of that. There's plenty of people that are working on that front. At Reinvent, we like to really step back and really think about new ways, or often radically new ways, to actually solve many of the challenges that America faces. And in this series, we're really trying to fundamentally rethink American foreign policy and the big challenges that are looming out there in the coming decade as well. So one of the things we want to look at in this case here is how can we genuinely protect individual privacy, but at the same time appreciate the extraordinary circumstance where we may have to deal with an issue around national security. Now, for example, it's in everybody's interest to stop a terrorist, let's say, who's running around San Francisco with a suitcase nuke, and no one argues with that. And the question is, how do we actually deal with that potential in the future in a world where we really want secure privacy? Now, on the other hand, on the other side of the front, individual privacy is going to come under increasing pressure in the coming decade as the technological advances kind of keep going. Individual homes will be smothered with chips and sensors and video cameras and all kinds of things. All our information will, of course, be caught up in the cloud. And so this issue is not going to go away. It's one that we really have to think through at a very fundamental level, and the sooner we resolve it, the better. Now, so what we've done today is we've brought together a group of very thoughtful folks who really appreciate the privacy concerns of individual citizens, get the technology, or many of them kind of deeply understand the technology, but also kind of appreciate the concern of those thinking about these more national security issues, and appreciate that that is something that needs to be addressed. Now, to help us do that, we couldn't have a better person who's going to thread the needle between that very difficult kind of conversation, and that takes the form of our anchor today, which is Brian Behlendorf. Now, Brian, it's hard to categorize Brian, but I would call him a pioneering technologist and a open source software kind of leader. I got to know him in the early 90s when he was one of the founders of a company, Organic, that was helping Hotwired, which was Wired Magazine's website, which was the first commercial, you could say, or I guess the first online for-profit media project ever, I guess, at that level. And Brian was actually pioneering that. He was also the force behind the Apache open source software, the web server, which soon grew to be the most popular web server software on the internet, and to this day even. And so he's clearly been a pioneer, and he's been moving over his career through all kinds of different technological spaces. The nice thing about him, though, is he deeply understands and has been on the boards of organizations, for example, that have been fighting for civil liberties of individuals through technology. He's on the board of the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Mozilla Foundation. On the other hand, he's also worked in government. He spent a couple years in the Obama White House. He was heading a project on open government project in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He also spent some time in Health and Human Services, so he gets kind of the government perspective. He's also, he's been immersed in the private sector too. He was the Chief Technology Officer of the World Economic Forum, which we know is known for its gathering of business elite in Davos. And he's currently actually the Managing Director of Mithril Capital Management, which is essentially investing in promising new technologies that are about to scale. So this is a guy who comes with a well-rounded background, perfect person to lead this conversation. We really appreciate having Brian here. And we also want to thank the sponsors of this series, Plowshares Fund, and three key individuals who are also behind it, which is Guy Saperstein, Katrina Vander Heuvel, and Dan Berger. All three of them have really been behind us from the beginning. Now, it's not just Brian, it's not just the partners there, but we've got an excellent group here to go around the table today, bringing to the table. And what we want to do is get everyone to kind of introduce themselves, get away from me and get to them, and then we'll eventually get back to Brian, who's going to frame the conversation. So Jane, one person we want to introduce is Jane Fountain. She's a distinguished professor of political science and policy at UMass Amherst, and she is also the founder of the National Center for Digital Government. Jane, do you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. First, thanks for having me as part of the conversation. I'm a professor of political science and public policy and also of organizational behavior. So I've spent about the past 30 years before the internet, when we were doing EDI and other pre-internet things, looking at governments, human behavior, social behavior, and digital technologies. For about the past 8 years, I've worked with the World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council on the future of government. I was the chair of that council and then the vice chair, and have been a member since that time. And we were one of the first of the Global Agenda Councils to really try to get this on the agenda at Davos in terms of what governments should be doing, not just what the tech industry should be doing. In other words, what both business and government should be doing in this space. Basically, I'm here and interested because this is the kind of tension that I don't think is going away. It's not completely resolvable, so we need to work toward a balance. Great to be here.
Appreciate you having here. Next we have Cindy Cohn, who's the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. As we know, always on the forefront of these issues, and she's been involved with the EFF for many years, actually, for over 20 years. So she's been tracking this from the very beginning, or almost the very beginning. Cindy, do you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm currently the executive director of the EFF. I was its legal director for 15 years before that. And for about 8 years before that, I handled one of the very first cases, well, frankly, one of the first cases of the internet, but it involved encryption technology and freeing up encryption technology from government regulation. Strong encryption used to be on the U.S. munitions list next to surface-to-air missiles and tanks. We worked hard in the courts and got that thrown out. But that case, I think there were a lot of us at that time who thought the issue had been settled, and so I think there are. I'm among many people who kind of feel a little bit like this is that Bill Murray movie Groundhog Day, and we're back having the same conversation we had in the 90s again. But turns out we were right then, so we'll talk a little bit more later about why I think we're still right today.
Groundhog Day, yes. Thank you for coming yet again to the table on this. Next we've got Derek Khanna. He's an associate at Fenwick & West. He's submitted an amicus brief on the All Writs Act. He previously was a House and Senate staffer on national security issues. You want to talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, we submitted a brief on the All Writs Act and the Apple case, as it seems like every other organization did as well, including Mozilla and EFF. When I worked on the Hill, I worked on national security issues in addition to technology. And one of the issues I worked on in particular was cell phone unlocking, which results in legislation, which seems more relevant in light of the recent Apple case. So really excited to be here.
And it's great to have you. Next, and finally, we have David Atkins, and he's a journalist who is published in various outlets, and he's a regular writer at the Washington Monthly. David, give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. In addition to writing at the Washington Monthly and other outlets about various topics of public policy, I'm also president of the Pollux Group, which is a marketing research and public policy firm specializing in technology issues and in various aspects of public policy. And this is an issue that I've both written about significantly and conducted a variety of research around. So this is very interesting and excited to be here.
Terrific. Great to have you. And so now it goes back to Brian. Brian, why don't you set the table here and let's get into the conversation.
Thanks, Pete. So, perhaps the original sin in this conversation was committed by Ben Franklin in 1755 when he said, "Those who those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And I think many of us have this in our heads when we think about the technologies we use and their correlation to perhaps the uniquely American concept of security and privacy and a lot of the constitutional kind of framing that we have around some of these issues. I mean, certainly the Apple versus FBI case brings up not only Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues, but also thanks to the Bernstein case, and if you read some of the amicus briefs, the First Amendment issues involving freedom of speech. I'd even argue there's a Third Amendment issue here, which is harboring no citizen can be compelled to harbor a soldier in their home, right? And so this tension between who we are as people and what is it that society needs from us, demands from us in order to meet some societal goal of security is a very hot topic, and one that I'd love to see us get away from the dichotomy, from this tension, but we need new tools. We need to recognize that what's happening here in the States is not even unique. We saw, for example, in Brazil last week, the arrest of a Facebook executive because the Brazilian police have been demanding information that they believed was in the hands of Facebook, of a WhatsApp user in their communications. Facebook said it's encrypted conversations, we don't even have access to it. We couldn't give you what you asked for, and yet they still arrested an exec. Now, I understand they released him the next day, but the French have proposed legislation to do the very same thing. Jail technology executives when they don't produce data, produce encrypted messages, right? And so this is a hot conversation, and certainly many countries have lived for a long time under regimes where the assumption was communications are surveillable, actions are surveillable, and that's in the greater security interests of everybody. We in the States here perhaps have had a more enlightened view traditionally, but the current both the current Apple FBI case, but many of the other kind of things that are going on in this seem to reflect this tension that's not unlike, say, Second Amendment, gun owners versus gun control kind of debates, where this polarization between the two sides has led to both difficulty in actually passing legislation and difficulty perhaps even in having conversations with people on the other side of the spectrum from us. We as geeks care quite a bit about the integrity of our technologies. We want to know that when a phone is storing our confidential information, we know what the criteria are for who it's sharing that information with, and so on. And to us, that represents true security. But we have to be careful as we start to talk with others about that, though, and in that if we don't frame it correctly, if we don't try to find this resonance, find examples, find metaphors, find ways of expressing this that show this correlation between security and privacy rather than antagonization between them, we could end up looking unsympathetic or unempathic towards what are some actually really devastating threats out there. Not only the suitcase nukes and terrorists coordinating actions, in different locations, but what about we have 3D printed guns and DNA printed viruses and other things that start to ask this question: are there some secrets that are too dangerous to keep? That is a reasonable question. We may disagree with its premise, but we will continue to be asked over and over. And so in this conversation, I'd really like us to explore how we got here, what have been some of the cases that have drawn us into this kind of tension that we have now, to try to understand the root of that. What's likely to happen in the short term? We know that Apple v. FBI is actually only possible because of a bug in the Apple operating system that allows you to update a part of it without asking for a password. These bugs will be closed. The vendors will start to move to unbreakable crypto. We need to think about what happens at that time, and how we have that conversation. And then let's also project forward a little bit. What happens in 5 years, perhaps even 10 years, when that boundary between external technology and our person gets even blurrier, right? Whether it's more people spending more time in virtual reality or alternative reality, or it's even some of the brain-computer interface projects out there. that you know the government themselves are funding, right? How do we come up with ways of talking about this issue and examples, court cases, technologies, you know, but also really ways of framing this for the broader public that helps us have an enlightened conversation about this, rather than something that falls into a stasis the way that so many other issues do. So that's the broad brush I'd like to pose to the for our conversation.
So to start it off, do you want to kind of start back? You were mentioning go back to the beginning and start how do we get here kind of question. Is that where you want to start?
Yeah, so I'd kind of like to open it up to the floor a little bit and see, you know, there are some people here, I mean, the foundational case, for example, that established that code is speech, which is one of the most important issues in this conversation, was actually the case that established that as precedent was the Bernstein case, which Cindy Cohn fought and won for us. So in terms of recent history around this issue, I feel like in many ways this is a freedom of speech versus security kind of conversation. And so I'm wondering, Cindy, as to kick this off, are there some thoughts you might have about how we might think about this when talking to a broader population? I mean, to a broader audience. When you talk to lay people outside of our bubble, how do you present this in a way that helps them understand why this isn't threatening to their way of life?
Oh my goodness, that's a much bigger question. But let me start by giving a little history of the Bernstein case, and how why the courts think of writing in a computer language as, frankly, writing. The recognition that when you are giving instructions, whether those are in the form of a blueprint or a recipe or other kinds of information that can then be used to do things, science, writing in the form of mathematical equations or other sorts of things. We presented writing source code in the context of the Bernstein case as really just the same thing. It's the fundamentally same activity. It's writing down very specific instructions for how to do something in a rarefied language that other people read. And the court agreed with us. The Bernstein case was in the context of publishing code on the internet and the problems with the export restrictions. The Apple case is different in that Apple isn't seeking to publish this, but instead the government's seeking to force them to write it. And that's called compelled speech, for obvious reasons, in the law. And the court looks very much askance at making somebody write something that they don't otherwise want to write. Here, I think it's even more complicated or more fraught, because Apple doesn't want to write this code and sign it, which is really important. The way Apple's systems work, they don't run anything unless Apple's given it their endorsement in the form of a digital signature. So the government's request is both that Apple write something and that Apple sign it, and both of these have First Amendment implications, because part of why Apple doesn't want to do this isn't it just being stubborn. After all, Apple has provided a lot of information to the government in this investigation, all of the information in the iCloud. Verizon was the carrier. If you involve text messaging or calls or anything that was done on the phone that involved going to a website or other information, and that information is all available from other people. So what's actually on the phone, I think, is a pretty small subset of the information available. Why Apple said, well, we cooperated with you this far, but we can't take this next step, is because they think it's dangerous. And in some ways, the framing of this as privacy versus security is, I think, missing why it's important, frankly, to Apple. And to a lot of us, is it's security versus security, that we understand that the way the technological infrastructure works right now, having a phone that isn't vulnerable to outsiders getting into it is useful to you because of your privacy, but it's actually, I think, the reason Apple started securing this is it's important for security, to protect you against bad guys, to protect you against hackers, to protect you against somebody who gets a hold of your phone. There are 3 million phones stolen in this country in 2013 alone. So this is a real problem for people. And so having Apple draw this line is not just about, it's definitely a free speech issue, but they took the position on the free speech issue because of their very strongly held belief, and one I agree with, that you can't build a door into a secure device using software that only good guys can use and that bad guys won't use. And so when you back up the act of writing and the act of signing with the security concerns that Apple's raised, I think you do have a situation in which Apple is basically being forced to capitulate to the government's views on security rather than stand up for its own.
No, that is a great way of kind of framing that issue, and also kind of showing that you know, the debate really is between two concepts of security. And I'm also wondering how U.S. specific both this case is, but also a lot of the conversation has been. And so I wanted to potentially open the floor to Jane next and try to get her sense for, you know, there's for the last few years, the world has been on notice that you know, that the U.S. government has been surveilling the world, perhaps even our closest friends and allies, right? Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. People are around the world, governments as well as individuals, are starting to see the importance of having secure cryptography, secure communications that you know, even new kinds of threats can't penetrate, can't get inside. And Jane, maybe you could help us understand how international governments are viewing this issue, because you know, they certainly have the interest in keeping their conversations confidential amongst themselves, and yet no doubt they want to be able to surveil their own citizens. You know, and they'll put it in softer language, like trying to understand what's going on, the conversation, the milieu. But you know, countries do differ on their respect for freedom of speech. And so, what would you say would be not so much the international view on Apple v. FBI, but more this broader question of confidentiality and you know, are there secrets that are too important to keep, or are there? Does the primacy of truly strong crypto win out over everything else?
Great question. Lots of directions one could take it. I've been saying for probably more than 20 years that in the area of privacy and consumer rights in a digital age, that the EU is out in front of the US. In the European Union, the right to privacy is seen as a fundamental human right, on a par with freedom of expression. If you think about the US, our right to privacy, you can look at it constitutionally, or you could sort of divide it by industry sectors, where you have certain rights in medical and health care to your medical records, etc. Other rights in the credit market and around credit cards, about what's secret and what's not secret. So these things are parsed differently. Relationship, first of all, between the state, what we're calling government, and businesses and industry. We have a different relationship with our businesses and industry in the U.S. than Europe. I'm painting it very, very broadly. So that's one issue. There are differences in this basic notion of privacy and what it means. But I would also bring in here that our domestically focused conversations on this issue usually leave out China, Russia. If we can backdoor into devices, you can be sure that Chinese intelligence could backdoor into devices. So we are in a hyper-connected, highly interdependent world. And we need to be cognizant of European Union standards and practices. We need to be cognizant of what authoritarian regimes would like to see us pass in the United States. The stronger we make state surveillance, the more we legitimate authoritarian regimes and their views of the state and what they would like to see as state control of the internet. And then you have countries like Brazil, which after the Snowden affair wanted to disconnect from our pipes. And if they weren't having domestic political problems, they would be in the process of doing that to just reroute their traffic so that it doesn't go through U.S.-controlled pipes because they don't want that kind of interference. So there are a lot of entailments here to try to keep in mind and that inflect this kind of conversation.
David, I'd like to turn to you and kind of get your perspectives either on the international picture or on the domestic framing, as I think you've written quite a bit about this, so I'd love to get your view.
Yeah, there's a little bit of both going on here. I think generally speaking, if you look at the history of privacy and convenience, people generally choose convenience over privacy over time, and governments tend to win the battle of privacy and security. And I think as long as we're framing it as privacy and security, generally the privacy side is going to lose over time. A more useful way to think about this situation is that it's a matter of public power versus private power, and that's a constant in American society and government generally. There are all sorts of reasons to constrain private power because of the bad actors among private citizens and private organizations. We're not just talking about terrorism as a public interest here. We're also talking about, say, child sex trafficking. We're talking about drug trafficking. We're talking about all sorts of other organizational activity that that governments have an interest in monitoring, right? And on the other hand, though, the problem is that if you give governments the ability to tap into everyone's conversation when everyone's conversation is electronic, then public power becomes the greater problem. Government can be a big problem, and maybe you trust American government to take these issues seriously, but one should not trust authoritarian regimes to take these issues seriously. And frankly, the Chinese government or the Russian government is probably a greater threat to the security and interests of their citizens than maybe the mafia is, or maybe a trafficking ring is. And so those things have to be balanced. And I think for the tech community, one thing that's important to note is that if we do have locked down encryption where governments cannot get access to even, say, terrorist or child sex trafficking rings or these other networks, that there has to be a lot more international cooperation and a lot tighter global systems to be able to conduct espionage in alternative ways. Because alternately, people are going to give up their privacy in order to make sure the governments can conduct espionage, electronic and otherwise, on these organizations.
Derek, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I want to jump in here. I mean, the Apple situation is interesting to me because for years we've been having this discussion about what type of regulations need to be implemented through government in order to regulate on privacy. And the retort for many in the tech industry has been that basically the tech industry is going to innovate on privacy and that consumers are going to choose privacy. And I think consumer groups thought that was kind of a pipe dream. And what's really exciting here about the Apple situation is that we're actually seeing that play out. Apple is actually finding a competitive advantage in consumer privacy, and Google has a little bit of a different perspective towards consumer privacy. You know, they have an artificial intelligence-like algorithm searching your Gmail account, for example. Some consumers may not like that. Microsoft has their own policy. That's actually what you want to see. You want to see a competitive market on privacy. Mozilla has their own policies as far as do not track and things like that. So that's actually a positive thing for the marketplace. And then the other thing I thought was really interesting was this past week, DNI Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, gave a testimony before the House of Representatives. And he said that the number one threat to the United States is not terrorism, it's cybersecurity. It's a cyber attack. And so we have this weird idea that we're focusing more and more and more on terrorism when the actual threat from terrorism has actually been declining. And we have this kind of cloud of nuclear terrorism or biological terrorism, etc. But there's no evidence that any terrorist group has even been within 50 miles of such a device, at least in the past 14 years. And so we're actually negating the actual what our own people are telling us is the biggest threat, which is cybersecurity. And at the same time, all the terrorists that we've been aware of have been using relatively rudimentary technology for most of their communication. So I think a lot of the discussion's really not been fact-based, it's been fear-based.
Indeed, it was really sobering to read the account in Vice of the Ukraine power hack that happened last month, well, December, because these people, hackers of unknown origin, and it suspects that there was suspicion that it's state-sponsored or at least very close to the state, got in and were able to map the power to control infrastructure of several regions in the Ukraine and shut down access to a couple 100,000 people, access to power for a couple 100,000 people, and for the heck of it took off their backup power supplies as well, so even the UPSs were blown, right? And it suggests that, I mean, there's been many others, reporters and others who've looked at the security posture of the U.S. grid and come away with similar concerns that, this is perhaps an even bigger deal than many of the other terrorist incidents that we see out there. Is the threat from weaknesses in our cybersecurity posture, and we simply can't afford to go backwards, right? So perhaps one part of this is to talk about the debate about what security truly means, and that's a debate that takes place on the ground. We think of it in terms of secure email, but maybe it's also really about securing ourselves in different parts of the infrastructure. It also is a debate taking place inside government, because you do have certain agencies, arguing for a certain posture in public, but a whole lot of both former and even some current administration types saying, no, this is the bigger deal. And maybe, Jane, do you have some more insight on that and might be able to flesh some more out?
Sure. I mean, just quickly, it's common for people to talk about the government does this, the government does that. So first of all, to go back to basics, right? The U.S. federal government is huge. Even within the NSA, you have a number of different agencies, a number of different actors and stakeholders, and they're not just in the government, they're public, private, and nonprofit. So, we have this term governance, right? This case by the FBI and DOJ was not brought by the White House, so let's make that clear. They didn't go to the White House and ask permission, they just brought the case. So now we have in the news that Secretary of Defense Ash Carter does not think that backdoors are a good idea. The NSA itself is divided about this. The Congress is divided about this. The White House has said they don't intend to pursue legislation to mandate backdoors. The FBI could go to Congress later if they want. It's not clear what reception they would get if someone would pick this up and write a bill and where that bill would go. So even within the federal government, you have lots of different stakeholders with different views on this matter. And what's complex about this is that you don't have this clear mapping of, I'm in this agency, therefore I have this kind of view. I'm in the FBI, therefore I have a different kind of view. One of the things that happened after September 11th with the Patriot Act was this breakdown of the bright line that we had in the U.S. between foreign intelligence gathering and domestic intelligence gathering, which we did not do. And we said, we think we need to do a little bit more domestically, and we think we need to break down some of the barriers between intelligence and law enforcement. But we are so far from working that out operationally or in terms of policies or even conceptually. So there are a lot of different actors here that we could call the government, but we'd be missing a great deal if we did that.
True.
I think this is
true.
Cindy.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Cindy. Sorry. Go ahead.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think that if you think about, to me, when I look at what parts of the government are on what side of this debate, the FBI is really very focused on forensics, right? They're trying to figure out what happened after something happened and catch, perpetrators. I think the people who are talking about cybersecurity are talking about building a system that's difficult for perpetrators to exploit in the first place. And, I think that accounts for some of the big shifts between the folks in the NSA versus the folks in the FBI about how they think about this. The FBI is trying to solve a case in front of them or get more information about a case in front of them. And the national security kind of more broader community is really trying to figure out how to basically, make us more secure in the first place and make those attacks harder to happen. And I think that accounts for a pretty big shift in how people are looking. And that's why I frame this as a security versus security debate, because depending on what security you're focusing on, are you focusing on, the metaphors aren't very good, but the security that has you choose to put a very strong lock on your door is kind of counterindicated by the security that the FBI is talking about when they want to make sure that they can get into your house in case you're a bad guy. And these are the two kinds of security that I think are at play here. And I think that accounts for why the FBI is, I think, not had its position shared by some of the people who think more broadly internationally and nationally about cybersecurity.
If I could jump in here.
Sure, go ahead, Derek.
I mean, I really don't think this is a left and right issue. I think this really scales, both parties. I think there's obviously some national security hawks on the left and on the right. But particularly, there's been a perception on the right for the past few years that groups such as the Tea Party groups have been, deliberately targeted by the IRS for surveillance. And I'm not trying to have a adjudication in this format, of course, but that's a big part of kind of conservative media. You have a few senatorial candidates who claim that they were audited as soon as they ran for office. This is a big fear. And it's dangerous in a country like ours, where you have organs like the IRS that can take your earnings, and quite frankly, overcriminalization. I mean, if you were to take the cell phone records of every congressional staffer and to cross-tabulate it against the campaign offices and see if they use their office resources to call their campaign office, I guarantee you would have at least 1,000 people you could convict tomorrow on a felony. And it's left and right. It just happens across the board. and so that's the real danger here of universal surveillance. And it's not a left or right issue.
Right. Very, very good point. Do you think it follows some of the realignment that's happening and kind of with some other issues where you have the inside the Beltway crowd versus the outside the Beltway crowd, kind of a dissatisfaction with the mechanisms of government and with the way society is going? And I'm thinking here of Sanders and Trump on one end, and kind of Clinton and Cruz perhaps on the other end. There is this kind of insider-outsider tension, and that's very real, and I think both parties missed. And I only worry really about that to the degree that I worry about what Congress might do. What Congress might do when Apple fixes its bug. When we do have devices both commercially provided by the largest company in the world and open source distributed, by individual developers, devices that create these unviewable spaces, right? These truly private spaces. What is the risk? Perhaps is a way of asking this in the next Congress, the Congress after that, of legislation being passed at the public's insistence, perhaps, over the voices of some of the saner heads, to regulate encryption technology. We certainly saw attempts at that in the 90s. What are the odds of that happening this cycle?
Well, I'm hoping that nothing happens, honestly, because usually these laws go into effect and they apply long after they're applicable, and then courts have to decipher what Congress meant when they wrote a law 20 years ago about technology that wouldn't exist and wasn't even on the horizon. And the way I think about this is some of these things are really what I call enabling technologies. So encryption in the 1990s, it just sounded like ciphers that existed since Roman era. It sounded like a tool of government for espionage. But what we learned is that encryption is actually this underlying technology that is essentially how e-commerce works. It's essentially how the whole boom of the 90s took place, in part because of encryption, and the list goes on that you've seen as the benefit. And I would argue that the emergence of the next computer revolution, the next technological revolution, requires these technologies. For example, autonomous cars, you really can't have autonomous cars if there's a legitimate threat of the autonomous car system being compromised and every car, being programmed to crash into the median at once. I mean, that would be an insane terrorist-like scenario. You have to have near full-time, full cybersecurity concerns recognized. So the more secure you're able to provide these systems, the more you're able to have an Internet of Things or autonomous cars or autonomous airplanes if that's prudent. And these are really enabling technologies. And so it's very dangerous for Congress to come in now. And you see in the 90s they were considering the Clipper chip and other technologies. And you look at the DMCA, which was basically outran its usefulness 12 months after it was passed as far as the DMCA provisions on devices. So Congress does not have a good track record here. And I don't think that there's necessarily a problem that they need to solve.
Jane?
Yeah, I'll just jump in here too. Derek mentioned Tea Party advocates being afraid that the government was surveilling them. It's we have an unfortunate history in the U.S. government, at least in the 20th century, say from the 50s on, of doing surveillance on. We remember the McCarthy era. But those were not only suspected communists, but civil rights advocates for other things. Right now, an organization called Color of Change, and probably others as well, are issuing FOIA requests because Black Lives Matter activists are being surveilled by the government. I don't think it's because we think anymore that Russia is trying to take over the United States through activist communities, which we might have said in the 40s and 50s, but that playbook remains in place, and you find it even for environmental activists, women's activists, civil rights activists. So it's a very odd space that people who are somehow, I don't know, not outside the mainstream, that's too extreme a view, could be subjects of surveillance. And you mentioned, Brian, the current election. The need for institutions, strong roles, strong laws, strong procedures, FISA court, delays, etc., is because we, even though we're a democracy, we don't know who will be elected. We don't know who will be in power. And so we can't depend on the goodwill of elected officials or the good sense of elected officials to necessarily steer the ship, right? So that's why rule of law in our institutions and the many checks and balances are meant to preclude anyone from really getting complete control of the reins.
Is there a synchrony here between the concept of strong institutions and strong cryptography? Is it you say one says the word strong institutions and the concept of checks and balances come into play and suggest that very much so we can trust individuals to have secrets. We can trust individuals to have confidential, perhaps even revolutionary conversations in the same way that, the very first, this is an interesting story, the very first federal agency actually predates the Declaration of Independence. It's the post office. And it was set up by the colonists as a way to have secure conversations without the Queen's people being able to watch what was being said. And I wonder if there's a resonance here, and I wonder if it's uniquely American to some degree that our confidence in institutions is actually our bulwark against our concerns about the whims of individual politicians, right? But maybe as we're searching for new framing for this, we can talk about Americans' confidence in government and the checks and balances as both a way to allay concerns about surveillance, but also to say we don't have to worry about confidential conversations. We're able to keep a lid on it. I don't know, David, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the challenges that we're dealing with right now is the way that the government is conducting surveillance. We've moved to a very sort of Silicon Valley-esque big data approach by the government and by the NSA, where it sort of is trying to gather all the information it possibly can so that it's not trying to pick needles through haystacks, but it's using sort of systemic analysis to try to discover threats. The other thing that we're dealing with the government is that there's this constant focus on terrorism when most of what the government is actually surveilling is not terrorist threats. It's very easy to point out the threat of terrorism is actually greater from, as others mentioned here, cybersecurity issues than from a suitcase bomb. What the government's more interested in is getting into organized crime networks and also, of course, on the dark side, infiltrating legitimate political groups for political reasons. And one of the challenges that we have to deal with here is that the best way for the government to gather intelligence is with human intelligence. The public is not going to give up, ultimately, the government's ability to infiltrate criminal networks, whether they're terrorism networks or trafficking networks or whatever. If the government insists that the only way it can do it is by electronic surveillance, then that's probably a battle that we're going to lose for privacy. If we, on the other hand, can insist that the best way for the government to surveil a child sex trafficking ring is not by tapping into everybody's phones, but by doing the hard old school work of human surveillance, then that, I think, is ultimately a framing battle that's easier to win for us on the privacy and technology side. It doesn't need to tap into everyone's technology networks in order to control bad actors in society.
I wanted to add here, I mean, there's this argument by the government that privacy is somehow a dangerous thing, or it's almost a temporary modern notion. And I found it interesting doing my research in the All Writs Act that in the 1780s, they had developed a lock called the Brahma lock that was an unpickable lock. And for 70 years, this lock was unable to be picked by anybody, including government agencies. And if you tried to pick it, it would destroy the contents within the lock. And nobody said, oh, you know, Americans can't have this Brahma lock. It's too dangerous for Americans. We need to ban this technology, or we need to order Jonah Brahma to try to figure out how to reverse engineer his own lock. Instead, they made a spectacle of it, and they offered parole to prisoners if they could pick this lock, and it became a national contest. For 70 years, it was unpicked. And the history of the American founding was fear of a tyrannical monarch, but also of the courts being the instruments of the monarch. The king would grant power to the courts, and the courts, through the general writs, they would use their ancillary power to issue general warrants to essentially look for evidence of crime where none was alleged to have been committed. And James Otis gave this famous speech about how these general writs were odious to a free people and dangerous to a free society. The instruments of those writs were the courts. It wasn't the king. Obviously, the king provided the initial authority, but the actual tyranny was being done by the courts. And so the All Writs Act in the United States was written to be the opposite. It's a very limited act, and the Fourth Amendment was passed the day after the All Writs Act was approved by Congress. And so the idea that for 227 years the All Writs Act has been very limited in form, but today courts can order anything that they deem important for national security is just completely spacious.
Well, as is this belief by whether it's the courts or whether it's Congress that the actions that they take here in the states to compel certain companies or certain developers to do things, well, you know, as if it were the only country in the world. That feels very specious to me. When I actually remember in the late 90s when there was this debate about the first time around the encryption wars, there was actually a company called C2Net that I worked with briefly, who did all of its software development outside the United States, especially the cryptography specific parts, and then built the product and re-imported it into the U.S. under the banner of Born Free. You know, today most of the world's premier cryptography implementers actually live outside the United States. I mean, there's plenty here, but there's plenty more out there around the world. And you know, they very quickly will step in, you know, as they have with Telegram and other technologies. Cindy, I don't know if you wanted to add more to the international story around cryptography, but you know, there's no way to put this genie back in the bottle, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And there was just a survey done by out of Harvard that Bruce Schneier, who's a very famous international cryptographer, did, and I believe he found 800 different encryption programs that were widely available around the world, many of which that were free, and I think well over half of them were created outside the country. So, you know, one of the problems that the U.S. would face if it was going to try to regulate in this space or ban really strong cryptography is that it would end up making Americans less safe because the people who are law-abiding would not have access to this, but it wouldn't actually get at the mafia or the kinds of people that I think David's been talking about. That bad guys are going to have strong encryption, and that's just the fact. The American regulatory system isn't going to stop that, and that's not. You can bemoan that all you want, but encryption is applied math, and it turns out the Americans don't have the only knowledge of how to apply math in a digital environment in the world.
Right. Maybe David, you could help us understand as well whether the American public is clued into that international side of the picture, and also perhaps where they're viewing the private management of their own data, right? Because many of them will argue, well, they believe in privacy all day long, and then they use Gmail for their mail account, and don't actually realize that isn't something that is as protected as something physically in their house. In fact, it's something that a mere warrant might be able to actually surface, right? Zittrain has even posted a couple of other interesting what-ifs about locating interesting information in people's Gmail accounts. I'm wondering, David, if you've looked at kind of public perceptions of these trade-offs, and whether you said certainly that they favor convenience over all else, but how do they really feel, and what could actually emerging technology companies do to play into those expectations, and perhaps enhance the level of security that people enjoy today?
Well, if you look at the polling on these aspects, and if you do focus groups on them, you'll find that the data is really garbled. You'll see headlines like "Millennials are confused," and that's really accurate, because what's going on is you have increasing concerns about privacy, especially personal data privacy. Privacy in terms of social privacy, the things people are posting on social media, sexting, all the rest of it, that's a whole other story. But when you're talking about personal data privacy, there's an expectation that companies are actually going to keep your data private. And that's one of the advantages on our side of the tech industry, is that people expect that if Apple has their data, that Apple's not going to give up their data. Especially young people know that Apple, Google, Facebook, that companies know more about them probably than the government. And in a lot of cases, there's greater trust in these companies than there is in the government, sometimes for good reason, I think sometimes potentially not. But the fact of the matter is that people trust these companies. So if companies are then divulging this information to governments, that's a huge problem because of the risk of authoritarian control. To come back to your first question, there isn't enough awareness of the international implications. Americans especially tend to think of America as the world. But if you were to communicate that, even if you open back doors to the American government, and even if you trust the American government not to abuse that authority, you cannot trust the Chinese government, the Russian government, say nothing of developing world dictatorships, to not horribly abuse that same privilege. And once it's abused in one case, it'll be abused elsewhere, and that's worse for people's security overall.
David, do you think the rise in the use of ad blockers and tools that block third-party cookies and those sorts of things, reportedly it's anywhere from 25% on mobile to 50% now on desktop, people running ad blockers. Is that evidence that some non-trivial number of people are starting to realize that they can trust some companies and not others, but that overall perhaps they've been leaking too much data, and that the retargeting that they see in advertisements and such is indicative that they've got to take greater care in their selection of technologies they use and who they trust?
I mean, part of it's trust, part of it's convenience. People don't want to see the ads, and if you look at the discussions about ad blockers, you'll see that when the discussion comes up of, well, if you use ad blockers, you won't continue to get free content, there's a sort of I don't care, wait and see attitude about it. But that's part of why you're seeing détente between the ad blockers and the media companies about it. But yes, absolutely. Part of the discussion of ad blockers is, frankly, that people know that all sorts of third parties are having access to their data, and they can't necessarily trust the third parties. So it's not just about removing the ads, it's also about not letting so many entities have their cookies. But if you take a look at, say, Venmo, for instance, this is a fascinating example where older generations don't necessarily trust Venmo. Venmo is a single point of failure for your bank account data. But millennials, I've had conversations with millennials about Venmo and the issues related to it, and it's more like, yeah, well, it's a single point of failure, but problem is our data is encompassed in a number of single points of failure, and if that's accessed, we're all sort of screwed in the same boat together. And there's sort of a shrugging acceptance of that. And the fewer backdoors, I think, the better.
So, I won't say that I tried to get a member of the law enforcement or Department of Justice to speak on the record in this conversation. I certainly considered it, searched my network for people I thought would be free to talk, and surprisingly, unsurprisingly, perhaps very few, could. It was, we certainly all kind of share a similar perspective here. So let me try to ask something that may be an anathema to a lot of us, which is, are there scenarios, are there situations where, the need for information from law enforcement has rung true with us on an emotional level? And are there any of us who have felt like there is room for compromise, or there is room for, a framing of the issue such that we can appear sympathetic to law enforcement, we can appear sympathetic to the victims, but more importantly, that there is some constitutional framework or some philosophical framework that allows us to say this is an appropriate role for law enforcement and an appropriate set of actions that they can deploy to go pursue the bad guys. But over here, this is something where we're willing to even tolerate bad things happening. And I'm speaking more on a personal level for any of us here. Are there stories that we can cite that we've heard that rung a bell for us, and we thought, okay, let's find some middle ground?
Sorry, Cindy.
You can go ahead, Jane. I'll follow.
Okay, I'll be quick. We built into law state of emergency, acts of war, other conditions where we don't suspend all the rules, but we do change the rules because there are extraordinary conditions that have to be merited. Let me toss in an example under the general heading of law enforcement has, in many ways, since 9/11, much more powerful and sophisticated tools than they have ever had because of many of the things we've been talking about with respect to concerns for homeland security and our obsessive focus on terrorism. And there has the purchases by local law enforcement agencies of incredibly powerful tools are frankly bizarre. If we were going to war, we might think that they were okay, but they're over-equipped in many cases. I'm not talking about New York City, San Francisco, but much safer areas of the United States. Here's a little example. I think this happened in Long Island. Local law enforcement was Googling, and in a particular household, 3 different people were online in a family. One of them bought a backpack. One of them bought a pressure cooker. You can see where this is going. One of them was searching on something or other. They put these 3 data points together and decided they had found a terrorist and went in apprehension because they thought that they were going to stop a terrible thing from happening. It was just a coincidence, but we don't have good local level procedures yet that match the sophistication of the tools. And I think what Derek and others have called this obsessive hype about fear and terrorism, and the need to be incredibly equipped and on this hair trigger.
I think that's true. I also think that there's some legitimate criticisms about trying to use big data techniques to predict something as rare as terrorist activity. I think that most people who understand how big data analysis works will tell you that there's really not enough similarity in how terrorists develop and terrorist attacks develop to allow our big data techniques, which are really awesome at deciding whether you're about to buy shoes or not, are really fail when it comes to trying to figure out whether you're a terrorist. The one thing that I wanted to say to answer Brian's other question is, I look at this when I look at the range of information that's available to law enforcement and to national security people now. It's tremendously large because we all use technologies now that make a record of who we talk to, when we talk to them, how often we are, where we are when we talk to them, patterns, and they can do patterns based on how you type to try to identify you, facial recognition. Law enforcement has a lot more information about us at their fingertips or available to them than they've ever had in the history of this country. The founding fathers used encryption, it's true, but they used it on a pen and paper, and you could go out into a park or a private field and have a conversation, and no one could really listen to you now. I don't think that you can say that anymore. So when I think about situations in which I'm kind of sympathetic to law enforcement struggle, I guess I agree with Professor Peter Swire, who says that this is the golden age of government surveillance right now. They have a lot of things that they've never had before. And I see where we are in terms of people in the privacy and civil liberties community is trying to draw some kind of circle around what law enforcement can do that preserves our liberties to a certain extent. So I guess I think of them as kind of they're already on third base, and I think that focusing on the one next thing that they say they want here to force Apple to write and sign code, and thinking about that without the context of the broader authority available to law enforcement, to me, is not thinking about this the correct way.
Is there a framing that's similar to the nuclear security issue? We pursued research in nuclear technology. Well, we were and still have been the only country ever to drop a nuclear bomb, right? The history of the last 70 years since then has been pursuing both research in nuclear technology, but also working to constrain the distribution of that technology, which, at its fundamental level, it's not that hard to build a nuclear bomb. It's well within the capabilities of pretty much every nation state at this point, particularly those determined to do it, right? Is there something similar here, which is, there is a tremendous focus on a swords to plowshares kind of thing. How do we promote and encourage the adoption of nuclear technology for power uses predominantly, while simultaneously limiting its use for devastating effect? You kind of can't control it because it is pure information technology. We're not talking about controlling radioactive substances and enrichment and other very difficult to do things. But is there something we can learn from the nuclear proliferation containment process the last 70 years that'd be informative here, perhaps only in how we talk about dangerous technologies that have significant value but also significant downside?
Sure. I think there's a value of essentially international norms. Even though we created a dangerous precedent, the United States then led the world in creating international norms around nuclear proliferation. When Kennedy set out with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, people assumed that it was going to cascade in a very short number of years into several dozen countries with nuclear bombs. I think where we are today would probably be an absolute best case scenario. And sometimes I think it's interesting that we almost assume that other countries have a First Amendment, or they have similar restrictions in governmental power. And the reason that we make that assumption is because the internet almost has a freedom of speech like component hardwired in. It almost exports American-like values. And when you start to say, well, the United States, we're going to regulate this backdoor, it really creates a precedent for other countries in the world where they no longer have to justify why they're doing this to their own citizens. That's what America's already doing. And Stuart Baker did this whole blog post saying, well, Apple's already doing things for China. And I would add to that probably Microsoft has done things for China. That's been well reported. But the only leg these companies have to stand on to stand up to a country like China, which obviously has a number of citizens and as a market entity like Apple or Microsoft, there's a large amount of profit to be made in those markets, is to be able to say this is not the international norm. This isn't how we do business. And it may not be technologically feasible. And I think that's important. If you disregard that, you're really not just compromising security for Americans, but for every other country in the world.
I really like that framing. I mean, I'm an optimist at heart, and so I'm going to depend on the rest of you here to kind of bring me back down. But if you want to, I pretty firmly believe that not only could we make the case to people with national security at front center in their mind that America's national security is enhanced by the widespread adoption of strong crypto globally, right? To not only protect American, military interests, but business interests and civil rights worldwide, human rights worldwide. But that we can also tie this to American exceptionalism in some way. That we can lead the world in saying this is the norm. This is the way that you operate in the 21st century. And so now that's my idealistic side. Now I'm ready to be brought back down a bit to earth and wonder, how much does this fly in the face of certain countries, perhaps even unexpectedly, certain countries and their view of the relationship between government and the collective interest versus private interest.
This is an area where there is right now a major global ideological debate on whether we continue multi-stakeholder governance of the internet, which is our version 1 governance of the internet, or whether sovereign states will control their internet in their country. So this is a very different conception than the World Wide Web and a disintermediated internet with free-flowing information. If we go to the latter, and China, Russia, many other states would agree with them that sovereign countries should control the internet in their country, we have a very different world. And the implications, not only for surveillance, but for economic well-being, GDP in countries, the kind of incredibly interdependent economic and financial systems we've made would be enormous. I want to go back to the analogy to nuclear weapons. Joe Nye has talked a lot about the development of global norms that occurred over decades around the use or non-use and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and continues today. That these things are long, hard slogs with many, many people who devote their lives, like some of you do, to these issues to develop the monitoring, the rules, the bargains, the negotiation that can put together coalitions and negotiated rule spaces that people sign on to. Part of the reason we got some leverage on nuclear weapons is that we had so many, frankly, that we were in the lead. So that's something that I think transfers to internet. The ability to monitor is really important. I think that's something that will be developed. In the area of cyber crime, there's a move in the U.S. and I think other countries as well to say, if you have cyber criminals, let's say in Russia or Ukraine, or that those will be treated as state actors. Those sovereign countries will be responsible for those criminals. So you can't disintermediate crime across national boundaries and then hope that you could reintroduce sovereignty for control of your population. So there are a lot of points of analogy here, but I do think this issue that the global norms that are being developed in the UN and the ITU are very, very important. And it's quite important that the US and Europe and others work with swing states, countries that haven't quite decided which direction they want to go in yet, because that's where the key points of leverage are.
Right. I mean, part of the challenge that we're dealing with is the world is becoming a much, much smaller place. And you have a number of nation states with differing cultures and differing ideas about what privacy and security are. And in terms of bad actors and dangers, Your biggest dangers come from ideologically driven lone wolves or two international syndicates. In that context, the most dangerous thing you can do is give up all encryption, allow all sorts of nation states to basically hack into anyone's networks, while assuming that the best way to handle terrorism and bad actors of all kinds is to tap into cell phone networks of every single citizen. That's literally the reverse wrong approach. The best intelligence, as we discovered after the Iraq War, as we're discovering with ideologically driven ISIS lone wolves, is on the ground human intelligence. It's the only way to stop an international syndicate. It's the only way to stop lone wolf terrorism. And the idea that we're going to hack into everybody is the opposite of the direction you need to move. If you want to be able to build a nuke, access to the knowledge of how to build a nuke is available to someone looking hard enough. It's not about controlling the information. It's about making sure that people who are trying to build them aren't able to do it. And that just takes hard human work.
This is Cindy. I want to push back a little bit on your nuclear example as well. I really, encryption is vital to how people live. It can be misused, but it's underlying this browser that we're all using now to watch this thing. It's everywhere. I think of encryption as much more like a hammer than it is like a nuke, in that most of the time people are using it in ways that are completely legitimate, and that doesn't mean you can't hit somebody over the head with it and kill them, but I don't think that's the central use of encryption, nor will it ever be. And I think that if we start using analogies to extremely dangerous weapons, we will end up in the wrong place, because this is something we all need every day, we all use every day. It's just not right. To me, the metaphor is really sends you in the wrong direction, and frankly isn't really appropriate.
If there was any part of me that suggested a comparison between the two, I hereby withdraw that, because that's pretty devastating. It was more about, are there things that we can learn from how that issue was handled over the 70 years, successfully and unsuccessfully. But I get your point, absolutely. The real key question, though, for me, for you all, is there an opportunity for my idealistic sense of a consensus that we actually shift to promoting strong encryption as as key to all sorts of both American objectives worldwide, but also humanist objectives worldwide. And for an example of this, I might cite the State Department's support of Tor. Right, it's something that no doubt caused a lot of consternation with other groups inside government, but the funding was created and perhaps even oversold. It was substantial funding, but it was not the only funding for Tor, which is a worldwide effort. But the premise behind the State Department's funding of that was there are important voices, important human rights voices, whistleblower voices, that would otherwise be in severe danger were it not for this essential enabling technology that allows for people to hide their IP address, right? Very simple, very direct. And along with that, you accept that there are all these bad actors who can use the same technology, but it's still worth it. Is that an example that we can build upon, that we can cite, that is that something that will fall flat if we take it to much greater extremes?
Well, I almost think of the Woodrow Wilson quote, which is obviously now quite out of disfavor, that that the purpose of involvement in World War I is to make the world safe for democracy. And while I disagree with the use of intervention to do it, I do think that an American goal should be to pursue liberalization of countries throughout the world and more global norms that are to allow for self-determination. And the human experience has taught us that progress, liberalization, comes from movements of people that are able to consolidate the values and virtues of their population. People like Gandhi, people like Nelson Mandela, people throughout history, Martin Luther King in the United States. Now, each of these people, and other examples as well in other countries, they were despised by leadership of their own country. And they were able to survive by living off of the land and to communicate and to build and galvanize this movement over decades. And the real threat today is of total information awareness, the ability of totalitarian states to stop these types of people. But we have an antidote, which is encryption. We have a solution at the table, which is for the Gandhis of the future in North Korea to be able to organize in a way that's impenetrable to Kim Jong-un, or throughout China. And encryption is a really important tool of these movements, which is why the State Department has been pursuing it and providing suitcase mesh networks for internet throughout Syria. So we've recognized this for a while, and encryption, free internet, these are actually important for liberalization, and it actually brings out good and bad forces, and we believe in the end of the day it's going to allow for good forces to win.
Anyone else on the topic?
No, I agree. I mean, there are always going to be bad actors, and there are always going to be negative organizations. Ultimately, is struggling to liberalize to liberalize and democratize itself, and you absolutely need to be able to have access to privacy to do it.
I just wanted to jump in here on kind of the slippery slope we're talking about here, which is if the government authorizes, in the Apple case, for example, then that's kind of a door that's been opened for any other court. And in fact, in the government's application in the New York court, they cited another case that was redacted. So we don't even know what it said, but they said it gave them some sort of precedent for what they were doing. So this will be precedent for the future, whether it's other courts, the New York DA said there's about 170 iPhones in a similar situation, or the FISA court, which the only thing that resembles a court is the fact that they use it in its name. And most of this is going to be going on behind the scenes. Americans won't know about it. But the precedent being set here allows for all sorts of things to be done in the guise of crime prevention or national security. And some of those things may sound good on face value, but the implications are quite severe. So I'll give you an example. This is a little bit risque, but unfortunately when you're talking about these things, you have to be risque because that's where it comes up. There's a organization called NAMBLA, which is promoting legalization essentially of man-boy relationships. And this is a legitimate free speech interest, although many people find it quite abhorrent, myself included. Now let's say the FBI were to say that they believe that a lot of child predators or those who may have child pornography are likely to visit NAMBLA. I don't think it's an unreasonable conclusion to draw. And they were to seek some sort of a writ from a court under seal, and the writ were to require the server hosting NAMBLA or NAMBLA themselves to inject malware into any user who accesses the website. Now, aside from technological feasibility, let's just assume that this is technologically feasible. That would mean that anybody who accesses NAMBLA.org, or actually I don't know what the website is, but let's just say it's NAMBLA.org, their computer is infected, their computer is run through by the government, and this is the precedent that we're setting here. And again, that's an example on child pornography. No one wants child pornography, but it goes from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And that's what we're doing, and that the implications are quite severe, and it's kind of nibbling around the edges. So the NAMBLA example, maybe they're worried about Fourth Amendment concerns, so they only do it for any international IP address. But is that really the road that we want to go down, where providers are forced to undermine their systems, inject malware, and individual citizens have secure systems compromised by the government because there's a court stamp on it when they're not accused of any individual crime?
I'm still really interested in the international picture here. So Jane, perhaps just before, I know you have to leave a bit early, are there opportunities in the international sphere where norms are being discussed, negotiated? I think partly I would say in the trade negotiations, but those have a bad reputation for coming up with anything that is pro First Amendment, pro freedom of speech. But are there other fora? I know you're involved in the WEF, and that there are folks from government on those different councils. But are there other opportunities, you think, and where's the greatest receptivity to talking about strong encryption as a creator of wealth for everybody, a creator of human rights that benefits, but also something where the U.S. actually could do something positive.
Well, it's a big question. I don't have a concise conclusion here. I think I would end by saying that researchers and people who are really knowledgeable, including advocates, lawyers, etc., on privacy, and those who work on national security, have to spend a lot more time together. I find that when I'm in one community, I'm hearing either all national security. I go to a privacy community, I'm hearing all privacy, and we need more opportunities for crosstalk and for people to really say, I'm not leaving my advocacy perch or my specialty area, but I'm going to inhabit, just for the purpose of problem solving, this intermediate space so we can try to, because that's where we're going to craft solutions that have meaning and that are resilient and sustainable. I think that we are still in the Wild West of the internet, and we're going to be coming up with modulated responses. So it's not just strong crypto, but whole varieties of strong crypto, right, that would be appropriate, useful, legal in different kinds of situations. And we need this menu and repertoire of options. So I'd leave it at that.
This is Cindy. I will point out that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights actually weighed in on Apple's side of the case, and the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression as well. The UN has been doing a lot of work around privacy and freedom from surveillance from a human rights perspective, and has actually come out in a pretty good place. And I think that's not the only place that this conversation needs to be happening internationally, but it's, I think, important that they have, and that they get the risk to human rights and to democracy and other activists around the world from overbroad surveillance. EFF helps a lot of people around the world who end up in jail because of their activities and trying to organize online. There are very human stories here about the costs of surveillance and the very human costs for people not having access to strong encryption and the ability to protect themselves. And I think those stories are important to be part of the mix here.
Thanks, Cindy, and thanks, Jane. If you need to depart, feel free. It looks like she just has. So one last thought while we still have a few more minutes before we wrap up. Project ahead 5, even 10 years, and always that's pretty risky, because in some ways I'm surprised by how slowly technology has moved since 2005, right? But let's imagine a world where we're not just looking at our cell phones every day. We're surrounded by our information technology. Perhaps we're even deeply embedded with our information technology. Does that change any of the conversation? I think since we're all coming around this table in favor of strong crypto, these things only become more apparent, but and more critical. But is there something emerging, and we might even want to start planting metaphorical seeds around that says, the right to protect against self-incrimination, applies, to our brain as much as it does to our phone, right? And are there other ways in which technology may change over the next 5 or 10 years that will shift the public conversation around security and strong crypto?
This is me again. I think that it's true. I mean, right now when people talk about their devices being an extension of their memory or an extension of their brain, they're speaking metaphorically, but I don't think that's going to be the case for long. And so to me, this comes back to the kind of First Amendment implications around freedom of thought and just basic Fifth Amendment liberty. These devices are increasingly going to be part of who we are and how we think, and they're going to reflect a very personal view of us. And I think that the need to recognize that early and make sure that we aren't sliding into a situation in which we're creating rules that aren't really how people live is tremendously important. We already have this problem. The federal law in the United States called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, for instance, assumes that people will download their email onto their personal computer, or in other ways leave it off the cloud. And it does that by saying, well, after 180 days, you must not have any privacy interest anymore. Well, this is a rule that doesn't fit how people live, right? People don't, for the techies, people don't pop their mail anymore. They use IMAP, but they leave it on the server. And so now, we're increasingly going to have a situation in which not only are devices embedded in our bodies, but devices that are in the cloud are going to hold very sensitive information about us. It won't just be physically, as in, I can't wait for the day when I don't have to wear the glasses and I have an implant, but it's not going to be that it's just in our body. Our memories, our information, stuff that's very intimate is already being stored with third parties, and that's going to continue. And I think that we will reap a lot of benefits from that world, but if we don't recognize the downside of it, I think we're going to create a pretty terrible long-term situation for people's, not just privacy, but basic liberty and kind of sense of who they are.
I mean, there's two
Go ahead,
sides to
David.
this, right? There's the tech side and there's the social side, right? On the tech side, obviously, strong crypto becomes all the more important the more your devices are integrated to your body and the more cameras are looking at you and the more surveillance you have. And obviously, the more big data information is available about you through them. On the social and legal side, and one of the reasons that people need privacy is that they are afraid of being blackmailed and they're afraid of being discriminated against. And part of what the problem is in society is society hasn't caught up in terms of its normative expectations to what people actually do with their lives. So you can still be blackmailed for things that everyone does, and you can still be discriminated against for things that everyone does. And there's going to have to be a legal framework that says, first of all, you need strong crypto to protect your data as much as possible. But on the other side, you also need protection from discrimination or blackmail in terms of your employment or your medical insurance against things that are part of your personal life. And there's going to have to be some sort of definition of what personal life is that gets walled off from what you're allowed to do for employment or the way companies are able to discriminate against you, because all that information is going to be out there in one way or another, whether we have the crypto or not.
Thanks for that. And Derek, how do you think this evolves over time, too? I mean, in whether it's in the political sphere, whether it's in the legal sphere, how do you think perceptions change amongst the general population, perhaps, as the technology changes? What is the straight line projection, and then what's potentially the big disruptive change that might happen?
Well, with all these technologies, you hope they get in the hands of consumers quick enough that they can see the benefit before the forces against them align to destroy them. I think it's whose book was it that The Future and Its Enemies, Virginia Pastoral. I always thought that was quite an interesting title. And I think the reality is that most Americans aren't entirely familiar with the benefits of encryption. They don't realize that the internet exists as it does with e-commerce because of encryption. And the media has done an interesting job framing this case as it's just one iPhone we're talking about. It's it's just information that Apple already has, and that's just not accurate. And so it's going to really take a while to get there. But yeah, so part of it's telling the story. I mean, I think it's really interesting that in the 90s when I started being a computer user, I remember, we were all scared of viruses and malware and stuff like that all the time. A really interesting phenomenon that I'm not sure if anyone has really written about is how, while viruses and malware definitely still exists, we've kind of, the locked ecosystem of Apple in particular, but also to some extent the Android system, has done a very good job of keeping most malware off of this new technological environment. I'm not saying that there's no malware, but it's very different than I think we would have predicted in the 1990s, and that's really important. This new secure environment allows for different types of things. I mean, I don't know if people would have wanted to have credit cards on their cell phones if you were in the environment of the 90s where a good number of computers were being routinely taken down by viruses. And so it's difficult almost to explain the benefit of a secure system. People become very used to what they know. And I think that's part of the problem is the NSA in the 90s became very spoiled. I mean, the joke used to be that any computer that was plugged into the internet was compromised. That was the joke of the NSA. And the reason was because the internet was open source and it had basically an open framework. And so at the time, the NSA was quite good at what they were doing. And to some extent, probably it was true. And they became spoiled by that parameter. But that's not the norm of American law enforcement. That's not the norm of national security. And there's no reason why that's the only way we can exist. And we've been scared into believing that there's this existential danger. But the worst case scenario seems to be positing that, you know, a terrorist group has one suitcase nuke. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we were dealing with a arch enemy with, you know, tens of thousands or 10,000 nuclear warheads. But yet we didn't throw out our national security liberties. There are definitely examples where the government ran amok, but we pushed back against that. So why would we now throw out our national security liberties for a threat that, even at the most egregious example, is so much reduced? It doesn't make sense to me.
Those are all great points, and very well put. Thank you, Derek. Well, I think, you know, if there's one thing that I learned, or really think that we captured here in this conversation, it was this idea that, you know, the security versus security is perhaps one way of putting what really should be the conversation we should be having, that we might want to really get crisper about talking about the importance of having confidence in the integrities of our technology, you know, as a path to being able to get into the whole next wave of what we want to do as a society, whether it's have self-driving cars, right? Whether it's protect human rights and civil liberties at home or abroad. You know, I think what we need to be doing is showing how the national interests, foreign policy, economic, and personal of Americans are advanced by having a strong crypto policy, even at the risk of having a couple of things that we can't see, a couple conversations we can't listen to, because that's going to happen anyways. Getting that conversation out there, I think, is the next challenge for us. And I really want to thank all of the conversation. Thank you all for the conversation that we've had around this. It's really helped elucidate it for me and hopefully for our watchers. And I'll turn it now back over to Peter.
Oh, and I just want to do my final thanks. Fantastic conversation. To me, there was a real emergence kind of consensus, very convincing, and I hope that a lot of the insights you had here will actually move into the broader culture. We'll do our part of getting this out there. This conversation is also a smaller piece of this. So thanks to everyone. I really, really appreciate what is a very important and timely discussion.